Time to join our first guest on the show this week, THC Live. We're going to do it via Skype. We're going to be joined by author Chris Bennett. 4 books. As we said, he's a cannabis historian, focuses on the relationship between cannabis, marijuana, and religion. Chris, thanks very much for doing this. We appreciate it.
Hey, lovely to be on your show. It looks like a really professional setup. Very great to see.
Well, you know what? From Skype, from where you are, it looks extremely professional. If you're sitting here, it's a totally different ballgame. Chris, seriously, when I think about it, is there a relationship between marijuana and religion?
You know, surprisingly, I would say that there's references to cannabis in some of the most existing world religions. Religions like Hinduism. Cannabis is used by sadhus in India in honor of Shiva, who's the oldest continually worshipped god on earth. In Taoism, we have references going back 2,500 years to cannabis incenses and preparations in drinks called an elixir of immortality. In Sikhism, the Nihang Sikhs particularly partake of a drink of cannabis called Sukadun. In Buddhism, there's myths about the Buddhism that are thousands of years old about the Buddha subsisting on 1 hemp seed a day while he sat under the Bodhi tree. One of the more controversial things that I've written about are references that Sula Bennett, an anthropologist writing in the 30s, suggested were references to cannabis in the Hebrew religion, Judaism, a term cannabosim. And that's a really fascinating subject when you look at her suggestions in the context of the biblical storyline. Zoroastrianism as well. There's ancient texts referring to the use of cannabis in Zoroastrianism. So these are all existing religions. And then back in the ancient world, you know, we have direct references to cannabis under various names that it was known by back then in relation to religious and magical contexts. So absolutely. Well, the ceremonial use of cannabis is older than any religion.
Let me ask you this. Is it always, or predominantly, is it used as far as religion goes as what you can see as a form of enlightenment?
You know, some cases, you know, it's lower dose and it's more about a communicative type thing. But in some cases, very powerful extracts of cannabis that would knock you right out. And more of like a shamanic journey where they would have like a dream and interpret that much like an Aborigine does in Australia as they left their body and saw things. You know what I mean? Heaven and hell come from the Ardu Virak, an ancient Gnostic text where the guy drinks 3 cups of a bang-infused wine, cannabis-infused wine, and then has his vision of the afterworld. So, yeah, it depends, you know. In other cases, like, say, with Sufis and dervishes, they would partake of cannabis and then play music and recite poetry, you know. So it really depends. There's a lot of variation from culture to culture.
Let me ask you this, because some might say then, you know what, maybe all religion's just a bunch of high guys sitting around a fire 2,000 years ago, and none of it's real.
Yeah.
Well, you know, this is something I think, you know, okay, let me talk about, you know, something that most Westerners will be aware of, and that's the biblical references. You know, and let's remember that Moses, of course, first meets the Lord in flames of fire from within a bush, right? But this burning bush apparently told Moses to make this holy anointing oil. And this holy anointing oil, and this is, you know, in Exodus 30:23 in the Bible, contained myrrh, cinnamon, other spices, frankincense, this type of thing, and also this herb in Hebrew known as cannabosim. A lot of Bibles now translated as fragrant cane, some translated as calamus. And Sula Bennett showed by tracing the modern term cannabis back through history and through the Hebrew language and comparing it to similar terms in Assyria and Babylonia that were contemporary to that time, kanabu, that this was a reference to cannabis. And in the story, Moses applies some of this oil on his body, and there's about 8 or 9 pounds of cannabis and about 1.5 gallons of olive oil. And THC is thought to be fatty soluble, may pass through the skin, but he also placed some of this oil on the altar of incense. And he speaks to the Lord in the pillar of smoke over the altar of incense in an enclosed little tent called the tent of the meeting. And so when you throw cannabis into that tent with Moses, was Moses talking to God? Or was he maybe accessing an area of the subconscious or unconscious via some sort of psychoactive substance?
Sounds like he was. Sounds like he was hot. Sounds like that was the first hot box.
Yeah.
It was a very common method of ingestion, and one of the cultures that the Hebrews were in trade with was a group known as the Scythians. And the Scythians were amongst the first people to domesticate the horse, the first people it's thought to be. And this was largely thought to have come about by the development of hemp ropes around, I don't know, probably about 5,000 BC, somewhere around there, 3,500 maybe, actually probably about 3,500 BC. And, when we're talking about cannabis, Carl Sagan speculated that cannabis was probably humanity's oldest agricultural crop. The word cannabis itself, the root word for it, canna, is older than Indo-European languages. When I say Indo-European languages, this is the common language that French, German, English, Sanskrit in India, many, many other languages are derived from. The parent language of that, cannabis as a word, was already existing when that came into place, and it's a Proto-Indo-European word. And it's thought to have come about in the same area where they were domesticating the horse. And that's why the spread of cannabis and the similar linguistics for it spread out throughout the area. It's because these guys were nomadic. And their descendants, the Scythians, who were riding around on horses and burning cannabis, would heat up stones in a fire, place these in a brazier, take that, put it inside a teepee-like tent that they had covered with a carpet, and then throw cannabis on that, and that would capture the fumes, and then they'd go inside the tent and inhale it. And that was a common method of ingestion in the ancient world. Same with temples. Oftentimes, it was such a huge amount of cannabis burnt, the whole temple was filled with smoke.
Wow.
And this was because pipes and bongs were yet to be invented. That was thought to come about after the New World and the discovery of tobacco smoking.
Well, obviously, you're extremely, extremely passionate about the research and the findings that you found through, I guess, your studies of this. So exactly how did you get into writing about this, and what was kind of the driving force behind it that really, striked your passion?
Around 1989, 1990, I had a very powerful experience under the influence of cannabis. It was right around the time I was finding out about the industrial uses of hemp and the importance that we needed for it for environmental purposes. Here in Canada, particularly, we were cutting down all our old growth forests and putting them into a pulp mill. We can make all our paper out of hemp, right? Things like that. I had this really powerful experience under cannabis. And I was trying to decide if there was anything to that experience or whether that was just my own, like I was just tripping out under the influence of cannabis, and I thought, well, if there was anything to it, then somebody somewhere will have written about it. And so I started reading books on the history of cannabis and many accounts, there's many accounts. I'm not the first person by any means to write about the role of cannabis in religion. Most of my research is based on the work of other scholars, archaeologists, anthropologists, that sort of thing. I just started kind of really collecting it and putting it into one place, and then trying to, make some sort of context so I could understand the role of cannabis in these different religions, understand them enough, that I could understand what the relevance was.
Chris, I think we've got a question from a viewer.
We do. We have a question here from Bobby, and it says, how does this affect our freedom? I'm a veteran of the Vietnam and drug wars. Although geographically separate, the city-states of London, the Vatican, and the District of Columbia are one interlocking empire called Empire of the City. The flag of Washington's District of Columbia has 3 red stars, one for each city-state in the 3-city empire.
Well,
Really, Bobby? Really, Bobby? That's your question, Bobby? Really? That's just off the top of your head, Bobby? Really?
Whew.
Interesting. Sorry, Chris,
Tongue
go
twister.
ahead.
Yeah, I'd say, in regards to freedom, I actually went to federal court here in Canada for religious use of cannabis. Lost the case, appealed. I could go back to court. I'm back to where I started with it. But I would say that the use of cannabis is even more of a fundamental right than freedom of religion, because we're talking about a plant here that we have been using for tens of thousands of years, according to the latest archaeological evidence. According to Elizabeth Whalen Barber, who's probably the foremost authority on ancient textiles, people have been processing cannabis for fiber going back to about 25,000 years ago. So we're talking about a plant that we've been using and ingesting for 5,000, 6,000 years at least, based on archaeological evidence. That we have this natural relationship. It's an important medicine, possibly the first medicine. Cannabis appears in the oldest pharmacopoeias in the world, in the Pen Sao in China, in Ayurvedic references and medical texts and from ancient Egypt and Assyria. We're talking about a plant that we have had a natural relationship with for thousands and thousands of years. And it's like our right to air and water. This is life on Earth and people and our relationship with the natural world. And step out of the way when it comes to the plants. Humanity has a natural right to the plants of the earth.
Chris, we are out of time. Thank you so much
you.
for spending some of your afternoon with us. We really appreciate it.
A wealth of knowledge, too.
Yes.
My
for the-
pleasure.